My name is Jessica, and I'm from Boise, Idaho. I'm going to try my best to share a true, terrifying experience that happened to me when I went on a solo camping trip late last summer. I know some might say it wasn't the smartest choice. A young woman going out alone to camp in a state known for producing its fair share of dangerous criminals, but I always carry a firearm. I understand that doesn't guarantee my safety, but it gives me peace of mind knowing I have a way to defend myself if needed. So, it was last September when I decided to head to Mirror Lake. I needed a break from the daily grind, hoping to enjoy some peace and solitude surrounded by nature. I also didn't want to take on anything too strenuous, so Mirror Lake seemed like the perfect choice. It's also a well-traveled area in the Cascade Pass region, and I always figured it was a good idea to have other campers and hikers around, just in case anything went wrong. And let me just say, I'm so over the whole beware of bears nonsense. If someone warns me about bears, I automatically assume they're not regular hikers. The vast majority of people on the trails are great, even the mountain bikers, who are way more pleasant than the joggers and cyclists in the city. But I guess on this particular occasion, I ran into the rare exception that proves the rule. I hiked about 4 or 5 miles into the trail before choosing my campsite, making sure it was tucked away from the main path for some privacy. I was exhausted after the hike, so after setting up my tent, unpacking my essentials, starting a fire, and heating up some food, I decided to turn in for the night around 9:30 p.m. I crawled into my sleeping bag, fashioned a makeshift pillow using my backpack and a bundled up sweater, and must have fallen asleep within a minute. The next thing I remember is a vivid dream where my brother and I were sitting in the back seat of my mom's car. I have no idea where we were going, but he kept teasing me about a crush, and I kept pleading with my mom to make him stop. She just sat there, silent. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the distinct sound of a zipper being pulled open. It was strangely loud, and I looked around the car, trying to find the source, but I couldn't see anything. Then, in a sudden moment of clarity, I had a terrifying realization. I wasn't in a car. I was in my tent, and the zipper sound wasn't coming from a dream. Someone was outside, opening my tent. The abrupt shift from the dream's daylight to the pitch-black interior of my tent was something I'll never forget. I went from complete unconsciousness to instant awareness with a single thought. Grab your gun now. I had put in hours at the range practicing with my firearm, a compact 9mm, small, easy to carry, and even easier to operate. But despite all my training, I had never imagined a moment where I'd truly need to use it. My instructor had warned me about the adrenaline dump, and he was right. Even with all my experience, my hands felt clumsy, struggling to grip the gun properly while my heart pounded in my ears. And all the while, that zipper was still slowly creeping downward. The sound of the zipper nearly drowned out my shaky breathing, but I knew the person outside hadn't stopped because the unzipping continued. I can only assume they didn't hear me fumbling with my firearm. The moment I finally got a solid grip on it, I forced my voice to sound as intimidating as possible despite the sheer terror I felt. I yelled something like, "Get away from my tent unless you want to get shot." Instant silence. Whoever it was didn't move. I could feel them standing just outside, listening. My skin crawled. I quickly followed up, my voice firmer this time. "I have a gun pointed right at this entrance. If I don't hear you walking away in 5 seconds, I'm pulling the trigger." For a second, nothing. Then, finally, movement. I heard them shift, taking a couple of steps back. Then, after another moment, their steps became quicker, but they didn't break into a run like I expected. Instead, they walked away slowly, deliberately. Their footsteps gradually faded into the distance until there was nothing but silence. I held my breath, straining my ears. Were they gone? Or had they simply stopped walking and were now waiting nearby, watching? The thought sent an icy wave of fear through me. I kept my gun aimed at the entrance for what felt like forever before finally convincing myself to move. Since I wasn't too deep into the trail, I still had a weak cell signal, likely from a tower near the highway, so I managed to call 911. The dispatcher told me he'd notify the local sheriff's office, but that he could also send a couple of park rangers out to my location on ATVs. He told me not to be startled when I heard their engines roaring through the dark and to think of it as my cavalry arriving. And let me tell you, it really did sound like that when the rangers finally showed up. But those 20 minutes of waiting alone in the dark, listening for any sign of footsteps returning, that felt like an eternity. When the rangers arrived, I explained what had happened. They scanned the area, but they didn't find anyone nearby. However, they did locate a fresh set of tracks leading away from my tent, disappearing into the trees. If the person had been watching, they weren't doing it from a close distance, which should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. I still felt uneasy. So, when the rangers offered me a ride back toward the parking lot where my car was, I took it without hesitation. That was the first and only time I've ever had something like that happen while camping. And honestly, even though it's never happened again, the experience shook me to my core. Not for the reasons you might expect, though. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you were seconds away from shooting someone, but let me tell you, it's nothing like the movies. I wish I could be the kind of person who brags about how tough and fearless they were in the moment, but the truth is I wasn't ready, and no amount of training could have prepared me for what it actually felt like to be on the verge of taking a life. My instructor always said if you're going to pull a gun on someone, you need to be ready to use it. Because if you hesitate, they might take it from you and use it against you instead. And standing there in the dark, shaking with my finger on the trigger, I realized I wasn't sure how far I would have let that person go before I actually fired. If they had grabbed me, if they had a weapon, I would have shot. But I think I would have begged them to stop first. That night, I learned something that no training could teach me. Defending yourself isn't just about skill or preparation. It's about the weight of knowing that in a split second, you might have to make the irreversible choice to take another human life. And that's something I still think about to this day. I spent my childhood and teenage years in the heart of Manchester, living a city life with little exposure to the outdoors. One day, I came across one of those reality survival shows, the kind where a washed-up actor gets put through some intense wilderness training. It got me thinking, if I ever found myself in a disaster or end-of-the-world scenario, would I be able to survive? Or would I be just another clueless city dweller struggling to find food and shelter? Would I end up lost and helpless without a nearby supermarket selling overpriced sandwiches? I tried convincing my friends to join me on a camping trip, but they all thought I was losing it. They pictured a neat little campsite with showers and a pub close by. When I explained I had something more challenging in mind, they all backed out. I had already discovered solo camping through the internet, so I knew people did it. It was just a matter of taking the leap and seeing if I could handle it alone. Turns out I was tougher than I gave myself credit for. That first trip to the Peak District wasn't easy, but I didn't perish and I actually enjoyed myself. I won't feed you cliches about feeling connected to nature or appreciating the brutal beauty of living like our ancestors, but I will say it helped put my modern-day worries into perspective. Standing in line at a bar waiting for a beer? At least you're indoors and warm. A food delivery taking too long? At least someone's bringing you a hot meal that hasn't been stored in a tin for months. The whole experience was great for my mental state, and I learned some real survival skills in the process. When I returned, my friends expected me to declare it a disaster and vow never to do it again. But to their surprise, I was already planning my next trip. Over the next 2 years, I went on several solo excursions, each time exploring a different forest. Eventually, I set my sights on Scotland, more specifically Galloway Forest Park. It was only a few hours' drive north, but it had some of the most remote landscapes in the entire UK. Imagine a massive ring road surrounding miles upon miles of untouched wilderness. Once you're deep in the center, it takes at least 2 days of hiking through rough terrain just to reach the nearest proper road, let alone civilization. The remoteness of the place was exactly why it appealed to me. It seemed like the perfect test of my survival skills. So, the first chance I got, I booked some time off work, saved up enough cash to afford the trip, and set off for Galloway on a chilly October morning. I drove up to a little town called Newton Stewart, where I stayed the night at a small backpacker's lodge. I even paid a bit extra for them to keep an eye on my car while I was away. Like my mates back home, the lodge owners thought I was out of my mind. Not necessarily for what I was doing, but for choosing to do it alone. They reminded me that where I was headed, There would be no mobile signal and very few people around. The only sign of civilization was a ranger's hut miles away in a place called Bunhill. Everywhere else was complete wilderness. If I got injured or lost, the chances of someone finding me were next to none. They made it very clear that what I was doing was risky, but to me, that only made it more appealing. I had plenty of experience with navigation and survival, so I felt prepared. After a solid night's sleep in a warm bed, I set off for 4 nights in the wild. I always got excited before a solo trip, but I have to admit, that excitement was always mixed with a little fear. Being alone in the middle of nowhere leaves you feeling vulnerable. The UK doesn't have large predators like bears or wolves, so it's much safer than hiking in the wilds of North America. Still, there's something eerie about knowing you're entirely on your own, with no one around to help if something goes wrong. By the afternoon of my second day, I had walked far enough that I was at least a full day's hike from the nearest person. That level of isolation was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. It gave me a strange sense of freedom. There were no rules, no schedules, just me and the wilderness. It almost felt like a glimpse of what it would be like to be the last person on Earth. That evening, I started looking for a place to set up camp. The terrain ahead was mostly grassy with scattered boulders, and there wasn't a tree in sight. I needed some tree cover for shelter and firewood, so I checked my map and saw that I had to climb a ridge to reach a patch of forest. It was a tough hike, especially with all my gear, food, water, shelter, tools, extra clothes. Even when you pack light, the weight adds up. By the time I reached the ridge, I was exhausted and took a break to catch my breath. From the top, I could see for miles, and there wasn't a single sign of life anywhere. It was both breathtaking and unsettling. After reaching the wooded area, I set up my shelter. A simple waterproof tarp strung between 2 trees, lit a fire and cooked dinner. By the time I finished eating, there was barely any daylight left. I made myself a mug of cocoa and left it near the fire, just as a little experiment to see if the residual heat would keep it warm by morning. Then, I crawled into my sleeping bag and quickly drifted off. That second night's sleep was much better than the first. Your body takes time to adjust to sleeping outdoors, and by the second night, exhaustion takes over. I woke up feeling surprisingly well-rested. As I laced up my boots, I remembered the cocoa I had left by the fire. I turned to check on it, but the cup was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had already moved it and just didn't remember. Then, I spotted it sitting perfectly balanced on a fallen log a few feet away. That's when it hit me. I hadn't moved it. Someone else had. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees, suddenly feeling very exposed. I grabbed my knife and cautiously approached the cup. Inside, the last bit of cocoa was gone. In its place was a single blade of grass, carefully tied into tiny knots. In that moment, my entire perspective shifted. I had gone to sleep feeling safe and alone. Now I realized that someone, somewhere, had been watching me. They had crept into my campsite while I slept, moved my belongings, and left me this strange little message. Some might say, "What's the big deal? They didn't hurt you. Maybe it was just a harmless prank." But that's exactly the point. Whoever did this had every opportunity to harm me if they wanted to. They could have stolen from me. They could have done much worse. Instead, they chose to make their presence known in the creepiest way possible. I packed my gear as quickly as I could. I was a day and a half's walk from the nearest road, and I had no choice but to keep moving. If I camped out again, there was no telling if the stranger would return, or what they might do next. I walked for 13 hours straight, barely stopping to rest. The entire time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one, just an endless stretch of wilderness, silent and empty. To this day, I have no idea who was out there with me. I never saw another person, never heard a sound. All I know is that for one night in one of the most remote places in the UK, I was not alone. We're looking back nearly 2 decades for this one. Talk about a trip down memory lane. But back around Halloween of 2004, I went on a camping trip with my then boyfriend, now very much an ex, and 3 of his buddies. At first, I wasn't too thrilled about going because I'd be the only girl in a group of 4 guys. I'd met my boyfriend's friends before, but I still felt like it would be awkward being the only girl while they bro it out for a few days. Also, and maybe this sounds bad, but whatever, I didn't fully trust my boyfriend and his friends to either A, pick a decent camping spot, or B, do much other than sit around a fire grilling food and drinking. Turns out I was totally wrong on both counts. While there was plenty of grilling and fire sitting, the location they picked was absolutely stunning. And for the most part, they were all perfect gentlemen. 2 of my boyfriend's friends were big on hiking and camping, so they weren't just going to plop down their tents anywhere. When we arrived, I saw that they had picked a breathtaking spot, no exaggeration. There was a waterfall a short walk away, meaning we had fresh drinking and washing water. Plus, they set up camp near a junction where several trails met, so we had our pick of easy, moderate, or difficult trails depending on how rough we felt each morning. It was the best of both worlds. The guys were fun, polite, and most importantly, gave me my space when I needed it. They also didn't make any dumb, awkward jokes about what my boyfriend and I would be doing in our sleeping bags, which was nothing because, let's be real, that's gross in the great outdoors. Since it was late October, there were hardly any other campers or hikers around, which was fine by me. I got to use that waterfall to clean up after we hiked. The next day, we had the trails to ourselves. No one drank too much the night before, so we were all feeling good enough to put in some miles. Afterward, we grilled, had a few drinks, and then turned in for the night. As I climbed into my sleeping bag, I remember telling my boyfriend something like, "Thanks for inviting me. This trip was unexpectedly amazing." He just laughed because he'd been telling me not to worry about it all along. For him, it was vindicating to hear me admit I'd been wrong. And I meant it. It wasn't just great, it had been perfect. Right up until the next morning when everything turned upside down. There are a few details I need to explain so the rest of this makes sense. Just before we went to sleep, but after we called it a night, my boyfriend asked me to put the cooler and the portable speaker in his truck while he put out the fire and cleaned up any trash. I did what he asked, then put his truck keys in the front pocket of his backpack, which was on the far side of the tent, away from the entrance. On top of that, my boyfriend was sleeping closest to the door, and he had his firearm with him just in case anything crazy happened. That night, we heard absolutely nothing. We woke up the next morning feeling fine, made sure everyone else was awake, and then unzipped the tent. The night before, our campsite had been neat and orderly. Now, not even 8 hours later, it was total chaos. The fire pit had been destroyed, and some of the rocks we'd used to contain the flames were scattered across the site. Every single door of my boyfriend's truck was wide open. The speaker had been shattered against a tree, and the cooler had been emptied and thrown aside. Our food was strewn all over the place, with raw meat just lying in the dirt. We sat there, heads poking out of the tent, completely stunned. The quiet that had felt so peaceful before now felt deeply unsettling. As we got dressed and stepped out of our tents, we started trying to piece together what had happened. More importantly, we wanted to understand how it had happened without waking any of us up. What started as a nervous discussion quickly turned into a heated argument. My boyfriend accused me of not locking the truck, which made me furious. I shot back, "Do you think I'm stupid?" I swore up and down that I had locked it because I had a crystal clear memory of doing so and then putting his keys in his backpack, the one placed as far from the tent entrance as possible. He stomped over, grabbed his bag, checked the pocket where I put them, and the keys weren't there. Things escalated quickly. My boyfriend snapped, "Are you serious right now?" and started demanding an apology. But the second I realized the keys were missing, my stomach dropped. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling of reality slipping away, but it's awful. I actually felt dizzy. Retracing my steps, I walked toward the truck and spotted the keys lying near one of the open doors. I kept stammering, unable to form words. That's when my boyfriend's demeanor completely shifted. He went quiet and simply said, "Let's go." After apologizing to his friends, we threw what we could into his truck and got the hell out of there. The ride home was strange. I felt like I was losing my mind, half apologizing, half pleading for him to believe me. I knew I had locked the truck, so what had happened? He stayed quiet for a long time until I started crying. That's when he finally muttered, "I know. I'm sorry. I believe you." But that didn't answer the bigger question. What the hell happened that night? When I kept pressing him, he finally admitted something. He'd had a weird dream. Not a nightmare, exactly, but unsettling enough to wake him up briefly before falling back asleep. He didn't hear anything outside, so he dismissed it. I told him to spit it out. He said in his dream he woke up inside our tent. I was asleep next to him, but when he looked up, someone was crouching over him. They had a foot on either side of his sleeping bag, looming over him. At first, he was terrified, but then he noticed that the figure's face looked wrong, like it was made of ski mask material but not actually wearing a mask. That's when he realized, oh, this is a dream, and forced himself to wake up. At the time, he had laughed it off as a dumb dream, probably brought on by exhaustion and alcohol. But now he wasn't so sure. I lost my patience and snapped, "What does that have to do with anything?" I had been expecting some kind of explanation, like he'd heard noises in the night, not a dream. After that, he clammed up, went into a diner, got us some coffee, and we barely spoke the rest of the way home. Later, when I called him, he said he didn't want to talk about it. He met up with his friends, and they all agreed to move on. No cops, no rangers, nothing. And I couldn't believe it. My boyfriend was obsessive about his truck, yet he wasn't even making an insurance claim. That's when it clicked. I think my boyfriend wrecked our campsite himself. Maybe he had a blackout episode, maybe sleepwalking, but I think he knew, or at least suspected, that it was him. We broke up less than a year later, and though this wasn't the only reason, it was definitely a factor. One of the last things I told him was that if he ever wanted help, I'd be there for him. But I don't think he ever did. And as far as I know, he never went camping again. My name is Jake, and I'm a longtime fan from Sydney, Australia. The story I have for you actually connects to you and your YouTube channel in a roundabout way. I met my girlfriend in April of 2018, and it was she who first introduced me to your videos. I won't lie, I initially found it a bit strange that listening to eerie stories helped her relax and fall asleep. But after some time, I started to understand the appeal, and soon we made it a habit to play your videos while doing the dishes after dinner. It became a sort of nightly tradition for us. Then, in early March of the following year, we were listening to some of your camping stories when my girlfriend suggested we visit a location mentioned in one of them, Warragul Valley. Warragul Valley is about a 4-hour drive from Sydney and is a well-known spot for hikers and campers. I know it probably sounds a bit crazy to hear a bunch of spooky camping stories and then decide, that sounds fun, let's go. But we were aware that actual crimes in rural areas were rare, so we didn't feel like we were putting ourselves in danger. And in all fairness, we weren't. But at the same time, that's what makes what I'm about to tell you so unsettling. So we made the drive out to Warragul and arrived on March 15th, 2019. We had ordered a bunch of new camping gear online and were scouting for a good place to set up our tent when we came across another pair of campers. They were standing just off the trail, and about 10 to 15 meters away was a burned-out 4-wheel drive and what looked like the charred remains of a tent. The couple was fairly young. The man was pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, looking seriously worried. My first thought was that these two had somehow managed to set their own tent or vehicle on fire, leading to both catching ablaze. I had no idea how they could have done that, but figuring out the cause wasn't our priority. We just wanted to make sure they were okay. As we approached, the guy thanked whoever he was speaking to and hung up just as we got near. Turned out the site wasn't theirs. They had stumbled upon it just before us and decided to report it since it was clearly recent. We could smell the strong, acrid scent of burned materials even from the trail, so it had to be fresh. The guy mentioned that there was untouched food lying around, recently purchased supplies, which made him doubt that it was just some reckless teens burning evidence of their antics. He had been on the phone with emergency services when we arrived, which was obviously the right move, but since it was already being handled, my girlfriend and I wished them well and kept moving. Looking back, it seems crazy that we just walked away from something like that. But at the time, we honestly didn't think anything sinister had occurred. It looked like some kind of unfortunate accident. Maybe someone had gotten hurt and wandered off to find help. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing obviously indicating a crime. It wasn't until we returned home that my girlfriend sent me a link to a local news story. The burned vehicle and tent had belonged to an older couple who had gone camping, just like we had. But instead of making it back home, they had vanished. They were now classified as missing persons. There was a public appeal for any information, so of course we reached out to the authorities. But truthfully, I don't think we were much help. We'd spent 2 nights in the valley after discovering the burned site. But aside from that and our brief chat with the other campers, we hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. For a while, we even wondered if the couple we encountered might have had something to do with it. I mean, we just showed up, asked if they were okay, then walked off after a brief chat. The guy told us he had been on the phone with emergency services, but we had no way of confirming that. We mentioned them to the police when we called in, and they told us they had already spoken in detail with the person who reported it. But they didn't tell us when the call was made or give us any identifying information about them. Spoiler alert, we were just being overly suspicious. The couple we met had nothing to do with the disappearance. We found that out for certain about 18 months later when the remains of the missing campers were finally discovered. It was tragic, but honestly, not entirely surprising. My girlfriend and I had assumed from the start that the elderly couple had suffered some kind of accident after the fire. Maybe gotten lost, injured, or worse, and then succumbed to the elements. My girlfriend even speculated that if they had inhaled too much smoke while escaping the tent, it could have caused serious harm before they even tried to find help. Not to mention burns, getting infected, or other complications. But then, the news broke. It hadn't been an accident at all. The couple had been murdered. Their vehicle and tent had been deliberately burned to destroy evidence. Knowing we had unknowingly come across the scene of a crime was chilling. Even more disturbing was that, based on what we later read, the murders had happened less than 24 hours before we arrived. If we had left for the trip just a day earlier, we might have crossed paths with the victims. We might have even exchanged greetings in passing. Or maybe, just maybe, if the trail had been busier, it could have stopped the crime from happening at all. We felt awful for their loved ones. But at the same time, we couldn't help but wonder about the details. Call it morbid curiosity, but my girlfriend and I were desperate to know what had really happened. Had we been in danger? Was there some random maniac targeting campers? Or had the victims been chosen specifically? As it turned out, neither. It wasn't some serial killer lurking in the valley, nor had the victims known their attacker. The entire thing started over something as trivial as a drone. The case was still working its way through the courts when I decided to write this, and from what I understand, the suspect's defense is claiming that the older man aimed a gun at him, leading to a struggle where he supposedly wrestled the weapon away and shot both victims. Then, in an attempt to cover it up, he set fire to the scene, including their bodies. There's even testimony of him describing how sick he felt afterward, how he vomited from the smell, all the stuff seemingly designed to make him sound like a victim in the whole situation. It's disgusting. Anyway, I just wanted to share this with you. Keep up the great work with your channel, and best of luck in the future. I don't know when this guy is going to be sentenced, but I hope it's for a very, very long time. Killing someone over a drone, unbelievable. Riverside Park used to be one of my absolute favorite spots in the world. I grew up just outside of Philadelphia in a place called Oak Ridge. Some of you might recognize that name, but probably not for the best reasons. I went to Oak Ridge High School, the same one that Sam Patel and Lisa Kim attended. It's also the same school that became infamous due to a widely known true crime documentary. For those who don't know, the documentary was one of the first major ones to spark public interest in real-life crime stories. It detailed how Sam was accused of killing Lisa, his girlfriend at the time. That case cast a dark shadow over Oak Ridge, and Philadelphia's reputation had already been struggling since a certain crime drama aired during my last year of middle school. I used to love both the city and the surrounding areas. I probably spent an embarrassing amount of time defending them in different online game chats. But then, something happened that made it impossible for me to keep defending them. It also happened to be the day I decided I would never step foot in Riverside Park again. My girlfriend and I had planned a trip there during the summer of 2016. Riverside Park had plenty of great camping spots, each with a fire ring and picnic table. I had spent almost my entire life hiking and camping there, which is why it was one of my favorite places. I also knew every trail like the back of my hand, including the most secluded, picture-perfect path that ran between the river and the train tracks. The trail was rarely used, and unless a train passed by, the place looked like something out of a storybook. That's exactly why I was so excited to show it to my girlfriend. I figured if I thought it was beautiful, she'd be blown away by it. Anyway, we drove out to Riverside, found a free campsite, and after setting up, we crossed the tracks and started our hike toward the river. About 10 to 15 minutes in, my girlfriend was having a great time, snapping tons of pictures on her phone. That's when we suddenly heard voices coming from the other side of the river. The river wasn't that wide, but since it was summer and all the trees and bushes were in full bloom, we couldn't see who was talking. That was until someone suddenly came crashing through the bushes and ran straight into the water. They looked terrified, and as they ran, their foot must have caught on a rock or something because they tripped and splashed hard into the river. I was about to jog up the riverbank to check if the person was okay, maybe offer some help. But right as I was about to move, the guy stood up, turned around and shouted, "No, please, no." Then we heard it bang, bang, bang. 3 gunshots. The guy collapsed backward into the water. It all happened in a matter of seconds. We heard the voices, saw him fall, then get up, only to be gunned down. I swear, I don't think his body even fully hit the water before my girlfriend and I bolted. The instant those shots rang out, we turned and ran. Everything changed in a split second. Just moments before, I had been the happiest I'd been in months, and then all of a sudden, we were literally running for our lives. I knew we weren't the targets, but I also knew that whoever was willing to kill someone like that probably wouldn't want witnesses either. The thing that sticks with me the most is how I didn't run as fast as I could have. The whole time we were fleeing, I kept positioning myself between my girlfriend and where I thought the shooter might be. In my head, all I could think was that if someone was going to get hit, I wanted it to be me and not her. I'm not saying that to sound heroic, it was pure instinct, and it came with the absolute worst feeling. Slowing myself down when I wanted nothing more than to sprint away, all while fearing that at any moment I might feel a bullet tear through me, and hoping that if I did, it wouldn't pass through and hit her too. She was incredible, though. She ran fast, stayed quiet, and didn't even slow down until we were safely back across the train tracks. Without a doubt, those were the most terrifying minutes of my entire life. If it had just been me alone or even with another guy friend, it would have been scary enough. But having my girlfriend with me, that made it even worse. I guess it was just that natural instinct to protect her, but deep down, I knew that if it came down to it, there was nothing I could do to shield her from a gun. The best I could do was try to keep myself between her and the danger. I'm proud that I did, but it didn't make those moments any less terrifying. We made it out safely and called the police as soon as we could. But to this day, I don't know who the victim was. And as far as I know, whoever killed him was never caught. A few years back, I decided to go camping with around 10 friends at a secluded hot spring in western Idaho on a Friday the 13th, which also happened to coincide with a full moon. The drive took a little over an hour, and since I had work the next morning, I figured I wouldn't drink too much to avoid a nasty hangover. We arrived, picked out a good spot away from most other campers, and set up our tents. Soon after, the drinks started flowing. Once we'd had our fill, we took a soak in the nearby hot springs, letting the warm water melt away the evening chill. Later that night, as the sky darkened, a few of us decided to take a moonlit walk through the hills to soak in the scenery under the stars. At this point, it was pitch black and not everyone wanted to come along, so only a few of us actually went. Quick side note, 3 of us had been microdosing mushrooms for most of the night, so things felt a bit surreal, but I never like to go overboard to the point where I lose awareness of my surroundings. So it was 4 of us, me, 2 friends, and one of their dogs. We hiked uphill for about 10 minutes, our flashlights lighting the way, until we turned right onto a narrow path. Not even 3 minutes passed before we heard loud rustling ahead, close enough to stop us dead in our tracks. My friend, who was leading, swung his flashlight around, scanning the darkness. Have you ever seen a big cat's eyes glowing in the night? It's downright chilling, especially when the cat is bigger than you. And when I say I have never been more terrified in my life, I mean it with every fiber of my being. There it was, a full-grown mountain lion, just a few yards away. Instinct kicked in and we all started backing away slowly. But my friend's dog had different instincts. Instead of retreating with us, it bolted to the right, disappearing into the trees. Yet the cougar didn't chase after it. Its glowing eyes remained locked onto us, unmoving. We kept backing away until we couldn't anymore, when suddenly, the dog reappeared beside us. That's when a horrible realization set in. If the dog was here, then what had we heard running behind us? We swung the flashlight around, and holy hell, another mountain lion. This one was smaller, likely the cub. There was a fence separating us from someone else's campsite, and we had no choice. We had to climb it. First, we lifted the dog over. Then we scrambled up and over, tearing up our clothes in the process. My friend gashed his leg pretty badly on the way down, but we were safe for now. So there we were, trespassing in some stranger's campsite on Friday the 13th, under a full moon, half tripping on shrooms, completely disoriented. We had no idea where the campers were, and honestly, we didn't care. We spotted an unlocked car, piled inside, and laid on the horn for a solid minute, hoping to scare the cougars off. To make sure no one mistook us for thieves, we yelled loudly that there were mountain lions nearby, hoping someone would hear and understand. But no one came out. My friend swore she could hear someone trying to scream, but her boyfriend insisted we had to leave. Part of me believed her, even though I hadn't heard a thing. Either way, I was more than ready to get the hell out of there. We eventually found the exit and started heading back to our own campsite. At this point, I was silently saying my final prayers, and I'm not even a religious person. When we finally made it back, every single rustling sound in the trees sent me into a full-blown panic, convinced we were being stalked. I locked myself in the car and had a straight-up breakdown for an hour. Meanwhile, everyone else was still having a blast around the campfire, even the other two who had just lived through the same horror I had. By morning, I was hungover as hell, didn't bother showing up to work, and got fired. Honestly, didn't care. I was just grateful to be alive. The scariest situation I've ever been in happened during a solo camping trip in late July of 2015. For those unfamiliar with the weather in eastern Kentucky or those who weren't living there at the time, the area experiences these intense summer storms every couple of years. Locals call them derechos. I'm not the best at explaining these kinds of things, so here's the official definition from weather.gov. A derecho is a massive, long-lasting windstorm linked to a fast-moving line of thunderstorms. While a derecho can cause damage similar to a tornado, the destruction generally moves in a straight path instead of swirling around. If the winds reach at least 60 miles per hour or more along most of the storm's path, it can be classified as a derecho. To put things in perspective, even the weakest hurricane has wind speeds around 75 miles per hour, so a derecho is basically like a small-scale hurricane. They can be dangerous, but to most people, they're more of a nuisance than anything else. Now, imagine you're camping alone in the middle of the woods, watching the sky turn black, and realizing the wind is strong enough to rip dead trees straight from the ground. That's when you'd understand why I was so terrified. Thankfully, while looking for a safe place to hunker down that night, I came across an old man-made shelter. It was nothing more than a single-walled concrete pavilion, which didn't do much to block out the wind and rain. However, if a tree came crashing down nearby, it might just be the thing that saved my life. Unfortunately, as luck would have it, I wasn't the only creature in the woods with the same survival instincts. About an hour before sundown, with the wind still roaring through the trees, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy charging toward the shelter. Because of the howling wind and the angle of the structure, I didn't hear it until the very last second. Before I could even process what was happening, it barreled around the corner of the shelter, a full-grown black bear. The storm had completely panicked the poor thing, which was terrible news for me. My first reaction was to throw my arms in the air and yell, trying to look bigger and scarier than I felt. But, as you can probably guess, that was easier said than done. The bear froze for a second, startled by my outburst, then took off running. At first, I thought it was gone, but instead of disappearing into the woods, it circled back around the other side of the shelter and charged toward me again. It was testing me, trying to decide if I was worth fighting over the shelter. And the terrifying part? Each time it looped around, it came a little closer. After a few more rounds, I could hear its claws scraping against the concrete just feet away. It huffed and growled, clearly confused and frustrated. The loops kept getting tighter and tighter, and soon, I found myself backing up, trying to keep out of swiping distance. But the more I moved, the more ground I gave up, until suddenly, it lunged forward and swiped at me before backing off again. At that point, I grabbed my backpack and held it up like a makeshift shield. It still had most of my gear in it, making it heavy enough to use as a weapon if I had to. My plan was simple. If the bear charged me again, I'd shove the pack at it, hopefully scaring it off. My heart was pounding as it circled once more, looking ready to lunge. But then, something changed. The way I held the backpack must have altered my shape just enough to spook it. The bear stopped, hesitated, then let out a frustrated roar. It turned in a quick circle, as if reconsidering its options, then bolted back into the woods. At that point, the logical thing to do was to leave the shelter immediately, since there was a good chance the bear would come back. But where was I supposed to go? Every moment spent out in the storm meant risking being crushed by a falling tree. On the other hand, staying put meant another possible bear encounter. If something happened to me in the woods, like a twisted ankle or worse, the bear might catch up and do real damage. But in the shelter, I at least had my backpack as a defense. It might sound ridiculous, but I was fairly sure the bear wouldn't return. However, I was absolutely certain that several trees would be ripped from the ground before the night was over. And no amount of yelling or waving my pack would scare off a falling tree. That's why I made the choice to stay put, even though it meant enduring a long, sleepless, and terrifying night in the middle of the storm. A few years ago, my boyfriend and I went on a camping trip during the summer in Missouri. The first few days were really pleasant, but one afternoon, while we were casually grilling dinner, we suddenly heard someone shouting for help. The cries sounded like they were coming from a campsite just beyond our view, but close enough to be clear. Without hesitation, my boyfriend and I rushed over to see what was going on, only to be met with something straight out of a nightmare. A man was slumped against a picnic table, clutching his stomach, with blood pouring from a deep wound. Apparently, he had been walking around holding a knife when he tripped, stabbing himself in the abdomen. It was bad, really bad. We quickly helped him lie down, my boyfriend pressing his hands over the wound to slow the bleeding while I reached for my phone, only to realize I had no signal. The closest hospital was at least 20 miles away, so even if I had service, help wouldn't arrive fast enough. That's when my boyfriend thought to ask him where his truck keys were. The guy weakly told us, so I ran to grab them. Within moments, we were carefully lifting him onto the truck's back seat and speeding off toward the nearest hospital. The whole situation was horrifying, but for me, it was especially bad because I've always been extremely queasy around blood. Just the sight of it can make me faint. I once cut my hand in the kitchen, ran it under cold water, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up on the floor. So in this case, I had no choice. I had to drive while my boyfriend kept pressure on the wound. If I had stayed in the back with them, I would have passed out, maybe even fallen out of the moving truck. And if the injured man bled out back there would have been 2 funerals. But if I lost consciousness while driving, we'd all be dead, or at least seriously hurt. I tried bringing this up to my boyfriend, but he insisted I focus on the road and not look at the blood. He told me to pull over if I got dizzy, but I think the sheer adrenaline got me through. We reached the hospital in exactly 12 minutes. Later, my boyfriend said we arrived just as the man was starting to slur his words, which is a terrifying sign. Any longer, and he might not have been awake when we got there. And as anyone with medical knowledge will tell you, that's a terrible position to be in. I still remember the moment the hospital staff opened the truck doors. There was a massive puddle of blood beneath him, and my boyfriend's jeans were completely soaked in it. After the doctors took over, we drove his truck back to our campsite, where we had to look after his dog for the night. We tried to salvage what was left of our trip and have a somewhat normal evening, but after what had happened, that was obviously impossible. The next morning, the man's brother arrived to collect his belongings and, to our huge relief, told us that he had survived and was going to be okay. The whole conversation was emotional. If you've ever had someone thank you for saving a loved one's life, you know how overwhelming and humbling it is. His brother had a lump in his throat, and so did we. After helping him pack up his things, we wished him well and said our goodbyes. Looking back, it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, but we saved someone that night. Not only did it have a happy ending, but it also brought me and my now husband even closer. Some memory we'll never forget. I'm part of a volunteer search and rescue team, and every year, we participate in an end-of-summer retreat focused on teamwork and skill building. One of the main exercises involves night training, which, as you can guess, is all about honing our rescue abilities in the dark. My specific role is as a K9 handler, which is actually what drew me to the group in the first place. I've always wanted to work with animals, but I didn't have the academic qualifications to become a vet. Handling search dogs let me do something meaningful with my free time while also getting to work with amazing dogs. I say work, but it never really feels like a job. During one of these night exercises, my dog, who is trained to detect human remains, suddenly signaled that he had picked up a scent. At the time, I was paired with a more experienced team member, so I looked to them for guidance. They just shrugged and said, "Let's follow it." Now, you might be wondering why I wasn't panicking at the thought of my dog finding human remains. The answer is simple. Cadaver dogs sometimes get false positives. In an area like the Pacific Northwest, where we get more rain in a day than some places do in a year, lingering scents can easily confuse a dog. So our protocol was always to let them follow their instincts and determine whether it was a real find or just a mistake. The senior team member and I decided to split up briefly. She stayed on the trail while I followed my dog, figuring that if it was a false alarm, we'd be back on track in minutes. But minutes turned into 10, and before I knew it, my dog was leading me down a steep incline. Then, I lost my footing and tumbled hard down the slope. The next thing I knew, my chest was on fire, probably from breaking a rib or two, and I could feel blood trickling down from where my head had slammed into a rock. The first thing I did was activate the emergency alert on my GPS, signaling base camp that I needed help. The second thing I did was call for my dog. I'd lost control of his leash during the fall, and I think the sudden drop scared him off, or maybe he was still tracking the scent, thinking I was behind him. Lying there in pain, disoriented, and unable to see well after dropping my flashlight, I could only call out for my dog and hope base camp had someone on their way. I don't know how much time passed before I heard footsteps approaching. Relief flooded over me. I assumed it was a fellow rescuer, so I called out something like, "Over here, I think I broke something." But the second I heard their voice, I knew they weren't part of our group. We do all sorts of icebreakers every year, and I knew everyone on the team, including the 2 new volunteers that had joined us. This voice wasn't familiar. It belonged to a man, and instead of offering help, he started talking in a way that sent a chill down my spine. He mentioned that I was lying in a dry creek bed, a place where people fall all the time. He said at least one person dies there every year because of flash floods during the rainy season. Someone falls, they get stuck, and then they drown, he mused. I went from asking for help to outright begging for it, but he ignored me, continuing his eerie monologue about how many people go missing or die in that part of the woods. I finally snapped and asked, "What the hell is wrong with you?" His response, "You're not in a position to talk to me like that." That's when I started screaming for help, even though it sent searing pain through my chest. Around that time, I heard my dog barking, an urgent, rolling bark mixed with trills, the kind that meant, "Hurry up, human." As soon as Brody's calls echoed through the dark, the shadowy figure fell silent. Then, as Brody's barks got closer, I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. A couple of minutes later, more footsteps approached, but this time, there were multiple sets, and they came with flashlights. I called out once more, and soon, 2 teammates were by my side, shining their lights on me. My first thought was to tell them about the strange man and the way he spoke about the deaths in the area, as if they weren't accidents. One of them immediately asked, "Were you pushed?" They were concerned the man might have been responsible for my injuries, and even when I assured them I wasn't, they kept checking the area to make sure he was gone. Eventually, the medic team arrived with an ATV and stretcher, and I was carefully transported back to base camp before being taken to a small rural clinic. After confirming that I had broken ribs and receiving pain medication, my team leaders finally relaxed a little. Several teammates visited me the next morning to check in, and that's when I had the chance to tell them the full story. About a week later, when I was back home recovering, I got a call from the senior team member I had been paired with that night. She checked on how I was healing and then mentioned that the team leaders were considering changing the location for next year's retreat. It turned out that a couple of other volunteers had seen someone walking around in the dark that night, someone who definitely wasn't part of our group. After discussing it, the leadership decided that safety came first, and they weren't willing to take the risk of encountering that shadowy figure again. Back around 2012, I tried to set up a camping trip for myself and a few buddies. They had been talking all spring about how cool it would be if we all went out into the wilderness together. Just a group of guys, no phones, just enjoying the outdoors. But as the date got closer, each of the 4 guys backed out one by one, giving different reasons for why they couldn't make it. It was a huge disappointment. I had been so excited for an adventure, plus I had spent what was, at the time, a lot of money on all the gear and clothes I thought I'd need. I was pretty bummed that the trip was basically going to be canceled. But then I thought, why not just go by myself? We had planned to go in mid-July, which was the perfect time for camping in the far northeast. If I didn't go then, I'd probably have to wait another year for the chance. So, I packed my stuff and, on the day we were supposed to leave, I went alone for a few days of camping in Camden Hills State Park. For the 3 days I was there, I had an amazing time. I had figured I might regret going alone, that I'd be bored out of my mind, but I was completely wrong. Between setting up camp, gathering firewood, setting up the little tripwire noise alarms, and getting the fire going, I was constantly busy. I didn't have a moment to spare until sundown. And when the sun finally went down, I wasn't exactly relaxed. Nighttime in the woods is seriously creepy. It had been probably a decade since I had last camped, and being alone in the dark was a lot to adjust to. But I eventually got used to the sounds of the forest at night. There's only so many times you can imagine scenes from horror movies before it just starts to lose its effect. By the 2nd and 3rd night, I was much more comfortable and was actually able to get some decent sleep. Then, on the 3rd and last night of my trip, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling seriously uncomfortable. And there's no delicate way to put this. I hadn't gone to the bathroom in 3 whole days. Every time I even thought about it, I'd picture a snake slithering toward me, forcing me to run off with my pants down and either making a mess of myself or getting bitten on the backside. There weren't any dangerous snakes in that area, but the idea of squatting in the dark just wasn't appealing. But at this point, I had no choice. I grabbed my headlamp, switched it to the dim blue tactical setting so it wouldn't be too bright, and walked a short distance into the woods with my wet wipes. I didn't go too far, but I also didn't want to do my business right next to where I'd be eating breakfast. So, I walked for maybe a couple of minutes until I found a decent spot near a tree. I'll spare you the details, but everything went fine. I cleaned up, pulled my pants up, and started heading back to camp. Just as I was about 80 or 90 feet away, I noticed another flashlight near my camp. The sudden sight of another person's light in the dead of night sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Sure, there were some innocent explanations, but there were a lot more unsettling ones. Instead of walking back to camp to see what the stranger wanted, I quickly switched off my headlamp and crouched behind a tree to watch. Some of you might wonder why I used the dim blue light in the first place. Well, if you blind yourself with a bright flashlight, it's tough to notice dim blue light in the dark. That's why I was able to turn mine off without being spotted. Anyway, I stayed hidden and watched as this person's flashlight beam moved around my camp. I couldn't see the person clearly, but I could tell they were inspecting my stuff, almost as if they were searching for something. A few seconds later, another flashlight appeared. Now there were two people walking around my campsite. The second person seemed to be checking things out in the same way, moving the light around for a minute before both of them started talking. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough to know they were looking for me. One of them asked a question, and the other responded just loudly enough for me to catch. He was just here. Hearing that was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. I get that two guys might randomly stumble across a campsite at night. That's not impossible. But to know that at least one of them had been watching me, that made my stomach turn. I felt like I could handle myself, but only against things I could see, not against people sneaking up on me in the middle of the night. And the thing that really freaked me out, I had set up a bunch of little tripwire alarms around my camp. Those guys managed to walk right in without triggering a single one. Sure, they had flashlights, but those alarms aren't easy to spot unless you know exactly where they are. I stayed hidden, barely breathing, as I listened to them for a few minutes longer. Then, I heard one of them say something like, "We'll just come back tomorrow." They exchanged a few more words, then turned and walked away into the night. I stayed put for at least 10 to 15 minutes, running through my options in my head. My first instinct was to run back to camp, pack up, and get the hell out of there. But I was almost certain at least one of them was watching, just waiting for me to come back. Plus, packing up would make a ton of noise, and I'd have to use my headlamp, which would make me an easy target. And that's assuming they didn't have night vision gear or something. I know that might sound like overthinking, but when you're alone in the dark with no way to defend yourself except your own instincts, you start considering every possibility. I stayed exactly where I was, barely moving, barely breathing, until I finally started seeing the first hints of daylight. Only then did I feel safe enough to creep back to my campsite and quickly pack up my gear. Instead of sitting down for breakfast like I had planned, I immediately hiked back to my car. I took a different path than usual, avoiding the main trails just in case someone was watching. When I finally made it back to my car, I stopped by the visitor center on my way out and asked if any park rangers had been patrolling the area the night before. They had no idea what I was talking about. No rangers had been out after dark, and if they had, they certainly wouldn't have snuck up on a camper like that. Since the park rangers also handled security, they asked if I wanted to file a report. If people were creeping around campsites at night, they wanted to know about it. I appreciated their concern, but I wasn't exactly reassured. All I knew was that I had no desire to go back to Camden Hills anytime soon. My girlfriend has a story from when she was in her early 20s, but since she's not one to sit and write it out, she gave me permission to share it instead. She grew up in Rochester, New York, and went to college at Columbia University. One October, after realizing she had a few days free, she decided to drive back home to go on a camping trip with some friends. She and 4 of her friends, all around 20 or 21 years old, took a trip to a campsite with cabins, fire pits, and picnic areas. As they were unpacking, they noticed that another group had set up nearby, a group of 4 guys who were about the same age. They got to talking, and after a while, one of the guys asked if they'd like to hang out later and have some drinks once the sun went down. Once everyone had eaten and settled in, my girlfriend and her friends agreed. Later that night, both groups gathered around the girls' picnic table to start the fun. The night got wilder as it went on, but everyone was still having a good time, laughing and getting to know each other. At one point, one of the guys went into his cabin and came back out carrying a gun, saying it belonged to his father. He waved it around like a fool while everyone told him to put it away, pointing out that nothing could be worse than playing with a firearm while drunk. The guy holding the gun laughed it off, saying there was nothing to worry about because it wasn't even loaded. To prove his point, he aimed at the sky and pulled the trigger a couple of times. No bullets fired, but everyone was still uneasy. They kept urging him to put it away, telling him he was way too drunk and needed to call it a night. For whatever reason, the guy took offense at being told what to do. After proving the first 2 chambers of his revolver were empty, He put the barrel to his own head and pulled the trigger. This is the part where most people can guess exactly what happened next. And they'd be right. That third chamber wasn't empty. Whether he loaded it and forgot someone else did, or he simply failed to check before tossing it in his bag. No one knew. But the result was the same. The gun fired, and he shot himself in the head right there in front of everyone. As expected, panic and chaos took over the moment. But my girlfriend said the thing she remembers most were the screams and cries that followed. She and one of the other girls focused on trying to give him medical attention while also guiding emergency responders to their location. But she admitted that the other girls' efforts were mostly for show. Deep down, they both knew he wasn't going to make it. Still, they needed to do something, anything, to keep the situation from spiraling even further out of control. She said it took nearly half an hour for paramedics and police to arrive. By then, the atmosphere was beyond grim. One of the guy's friends had gone completely silent, shutting down emotionally as he tried to process what had just happened. One of my girlfriend's friends, on the other hand, wouldn't stop crying. No, not just crying, but sobbing uncontrollably. Every time she started to calm down, the memory of what had happened would flood back into her mind, and the whole cycle of grief and shock would begin again. For weeks after the incident, my girlfriend and her friends struggled with what a doctor called acute stress disorder. From what I understand, it has similar symptoms to PTSD, but if they don't last more than a few months, it isn't considered full-blown PTSD. Thankfully, 3 out of the 4 girls, including my girlfriend, managed to recover within weeks. But the friend who couldn't stop crying, she ended up needing medication for PTSD for years afterward. Even today, she says that one night completely changed her life. The entire event left her with a strong stance against guns, and it also shaped my own views on the subject. I still support the right to own firearms, and I own a gun myself, but I believe there's a real gray area in the way firearm regulations work. A gun in the hands of a responsible, level-headed person is fine. That's never been the problem. But when you mix guns with reckless, intoxicated young people, something that's meant to provide safety can just as easily turn into something that brings absolute devastation. I came across your channel a few weeks ago and noticed that you take story submissions. This is the most chilling true story I know, and I can say with complete certainty that it happened. Almost exactly 6 years ago, my best friend's father went on a camping trip up in the Yukon region of Canada, to a remote place called Pine Lake. To most people, that might not sound alarming, but if you knew my friend's dad, you'd realize how strange and out of character it was for him. He left for the Yukon in late September, saying he'd be back in a few weeks. He hadn't camped since childhood, and even then, he never really liked it. The odd thing was, he absolutely hated the outdoors. He was the kind of person who preferred staying inside, messing around with his gadgets and tech. Then, out of nowhere, he developed this bizarre fascination with camping, bought a bunch of gear, and one day just announced he was heading out. Even stranger, he took the family's 2 dogs with him. This was especially odd because he had never liked those dogs. The only reason they had them was because his wife and kids begged him for years. He refused to walk them, clean up after them. He barely even wanted to be in the same room with them, calling them stinky old mutts. Yet, suddenly, just like his newfound love for camping, he became convinced that he hadn't spent enough time with them and that they deserved to go on an adventure instead of just lying around all day. I mean, sure, that's a fair thought, but coming from him, it was bizarre. My friend and his family started worrying that maybe he was going through some sort of midlife crisis. But what could they do besides let him get it out of his system and talk to him when he got back? Except, he never came back. When he didn't return on the date he'd promised, my friend's family reported him missing. The authorities sent a search and rescue team to check around Pine Lake. But as the days stretched into weeks, then months, there was no sign of him anywhere. No one wanted to believe he was gone, especially not his family. But by March, he had been missing for over 5 months, and people were starting to lose hope. The harsh winter conditions in that region made survival unlikely, especially since he had 0 experience in the wild. Then, in early April, a pilot flying over the area spotted a man with 2 dogs near the lake. He wasn't a search and rescue worker, but he must have known about the missing person case because he reported it immediately. The RCMP and a proper search team were sent to investigate. It didn't take them long to locate his campsite. They found collapsed tent poles, some waterproofing supplies, a tent, and dog-related items, but no sign of him. The waterproofing gear suggested he might have had a boat or canoe. That was another strange detail because he had never shown any interest in canoeing before. No one in the family recalled him buying one before leaving for his trip. After an extended search, authorities informed the family that they believed he had traveled to Whitehorse, the largest city in the Yukon. They had already combed the Pine Lake area and found nothing beyond his campsite, so they shifted their efforts elsewhere. Later, they expanded the search to a town called Dawson Creek because he supposedly had an old college friend living there. Maybe he had stopped by to visit, but there was no sign of that. Unless the friend in Whitehorse was covering for him, he insisted that my friend's dad never visited him. So where did he go? Where is he now? It's harsh to put it into words, but almost everyone assumes my friend's dad didn't survive. He went from being annoyed at walking the dogs to suddenly embracing the wilderness. Unless he had secretly been training himself in survival skills, which isn't entirely impossible, it's likely that he got in over his head and didn't realize it until it was too late. The authorities mentioned that even in the summer, lakes and rivers in that region stay bitterly cold year-round. In April, when the snow begins to melt, it might look like a decent day for a trip downstream. But if you fall into that freezing water without help, you might never make it out. They also warned that wild animals could have played a role, which would explain why no remains were ever found, except for his gear. But that's just it. The explanation makes sense. Until you remember that a bear wouldn't eat an entire canoe. And a brightly colored canoe would have been much easier to spot. I get that search and rescue teams have a huge area to cover, but they've been looking for him for nearly 5 years now. Even accounting for the disruptions in 2020, I just don't understand how, after all this time, not a single new clue has surfaced. In most cases, after 3 to 5 years, search teams find something. Bones, scraps of clothing, personal items. Anything to confirm a person's fate. But after they located his abandoned campsite, nothing else belonging to him has ever been found. Some suggest that a heavy snowfall might have buried his canoe, meaning it could be a long time before any trace appears. But the longer this drags on, the more it seems like he vanished into thin air. If I find this whole thing unsettling, I can't even begin to imagine what my friend and his family are going through. They put on a brave face, but I know the pain still lingers. They would give anything just to have some closure.